Alright, so today we're going to be showing you guys how to build a tower for terrain gaming out of nothing but a Pringles can and some foam core board, which you can buy at any Dollarama or craft store locally. I recommend that you get the cheaper stuff. Going to a dollar store to get your foam core, because the paper that's on top of the foam in the middle, they use cheaper glue to adhere it to the foam, so it's easier to clear it off and get to the foam. When you get more expensive stuff from craft stores, they use a stronger glue and it's much harder to separate the paper from the foam, and you end up getting a situation where you peel, as you may be able to see on the camera, I'm not sure, but you can get portions of the paper just split and rip, and it makes it a little bit tougher to get off. Whereas if you get the dollar store stuff, it's a little bit easier. But either way, I don't peel it off. I like to use an X-Acto knife to cleave the paper off of the foam. And then once we have the foam, we're going to cut it into either stone or brick shapes, and we're going to get a whole pile of these, and we're going to individually glue them to the outside of this Pringles can. And then once we've done that, we're going to mix up some Mod Podge with some paint, and we're going to cover the entire thing to give it a stone look. And because the foam already is aerated and has all that texture and the mini holes in it and everything, it has a stone look to it already, which is really great. So we're going to get into it here. Alright, so now we have our foam strips cut out, and from here we're going to be breaking it up into stone pieces, and then eventually we are going to kind of fit the stone pieces individually onto the outside of the Pringles can, which is going to be the base of our tower. Now, I had an interesting idea for how I want to complete this one, and I've never done this before, so I'm not sure if it's going to work. The two towers that I built for the front gate, I flipped this upside down. I put a piece on top and carved it out of XPS foam for the top of the tower. For this one, I would like to make an actual tower peak, like a shingled roof, and then attach it to the lid so that I can actually take it off and then have a little playable section in there. I know that's a little small even for miniatures, but just have like a treasure or something in there if players choose to explore it. So we're going to get these cut out, and then we're going to attach them to our can. Now there's a couple ways we can do this. I can actually attempt to cut out stone shapes myself, or I can try to rip it with my hands. So for the first one, we're going to try cutting it, then we're going to do one where I try ripping it, and we're going to see how they look. I did one where I ripped it, and those were much larger pieces for the front gate middle pieces on the walls. I've never done it for a tower, which typically would be bits of smaller rocks, so we're going to cut one, then rip it, and then whichever side I think looks best, that's how we're going to do the other four. So let's give it a shot. Alright, so we have our stone pieces from one of the strips, and they look a little too clean, a little too uniform for stone. I'm going to use my hands to carve up and rip up the next piece, and we'll see if it looks any better, if it looks more rugged, and if so, then we'll go with the hand-torn pieces for the rest of them. Now that I've torn some by hand and we've cut some, you know, I definitely like the look of the ripped pieces better. The sharper edges, they just look more naturally like rock. So I think it's safe to say that we're going to retire the knife for the rest of this portion of the project at least. And we're just going to rip everything up. So bear with me while we get through that. Alright guys, so I got the bottom pieces on. As you can see, they fit that flat edge of the bottom of the can. And you can kind of get an idea of what it's going to look like once we get all these pieces on. However, I used up the very last of my tack glue. Simple tacky glue works really well for this. You don't need to use anything stronger. You basically just want a decent adhering to the can itself, and then when you put the Mod Podge mix with paint over top, that's not only going to act as another sealing of everything, but it's also going to adhere things a little bit better. I need to go get some more tacky glue, but once I do, I'll come back and we will finish this up. Alright guys, so we have our tower now mostly prepped. I got the lid on here still. What we're going to do with this is I'm going to put a covering on it, and I've changed my idea a little bit. Instead of doing a shingled roof like I had originally planned, I thought it'd be really cool to turn this into like a bell tower instead and put like a mini chiming bell in there. And have like a little trap door leading down so players can go in and find, you know, a treasure or something like that. So right now what we're going to do with this, now that it's fully covered in our foam core, and we got our little bricks and pieces of stone on there, is I'm going to mix up Mod Podge, which I have here, which not only will fill in all the gaps, but it also seals everything. And I'm going to mix it with some darker paints, and this is going to act as the kind of priming layer as well. The reason I use really dark paint to mix in with this is so that I can see that everything is fully covered. If something comes through as white or red, you're really going to notice that against the black that we're going to mix up here. And so it's going to be really easy to tell if you've missed any parts. When I'm priming things, when I'm painting 3D printed objects, or if I'm painting my miniatures for Dungeons and Dragons, I like to also use black again, because most colors show up really strong against black as well. And even if you don't have black, like today, I realized that I only had a very small amount of black acrylic paint left. So I've got a brown here, purple, a dark blue. So as long as you're mixing dark colors, when you paint over top of that, the other colors will show up really well, and it'll also be easy to see if you've missed anything. So next up, we're gonna mix up our Mod Podge, and then we're gonna put everything all over this. We're gonna slather it on, and after that, we'll go into some dry brushing and some washes and show you guys how we do that. So let's get into it. All right, so as you can see, my my little dish that I use here for mixing my Mod Podge, I've had a lot of different paints in here, and I've done this mixture many times, so it looks absolutely disgusting. But that's all right, because we're only going to pour more disgusting mixtures inside, so it is wonderful for what we're doing. We're going to pour in a good amount of Mod Podge here. I tend to sometimes make too much of the mixture. I would much rather have it done and have too much than have to go back and try to find the right mixture again. And again, like I said, I really ran out of black paints, so I know there's some stuff in these containers. I'm not sure how much, but it might be an interesting mixture that we come up with. All right, so we have our mixture now, which is it's a grayish color, but it's still pretty dark. It'll work for what we're doing. And I've got a couple brushes here, smaller one for getting into some, some smaller spaces if say the Mod Podge mixture isn't getting in between some of these cracks from the larger brush, so we can go in and make sure we're getting it. Let's just get started. And you really want to apply this generously, like really kind of dig the brush in. It's not so much about spreading it out, you're trying to fill in all these spaces. When this is done, you want it to look like it's just a big, glob of stone and rock. Alright, so as you can see now, this is mostly covered and filled in. There are a few places where I can already see a little bit of red showing through, like there. So I'm going to use a smaller brush to try to fill those in, and then we're going to let this sit and dry for a couple hours at least and see what we're looking at, longer if we have to, and then we'll come back in and start doing a paint job on it. Alright, so now we have our tower completely covered in our dark paint mixed with Mod Podge. So it is fully sealed in here now, which is great. There are a couple little spaces in here that were not completely covered. The red showed through, so I went through with just some clear Mod Podge just to make sure it was sealed and it dried up. So now the paint will still adhere to everything. It's still completely protected and sealed, so it's not going to wear down the cardboard that makes up the can. Our next stages, we're going to cover everything in a lighter gray paint to give it more of a stone color. Then we're going to dry brush to give the stone highlights, and it's going to naturally bring out some of the ridges and indents of the foam. And then we're going to put our wash over top. Now the reason we do a wash, and typically we use a much darker wash, is that it will fill into the recesses and make it look like it's naturally weathered, like dirt has collected over many years to give it a natural rock look. Something I learned from Black Magic Craft, which is another terrain building YouTube page, is to add a little bit of dish soap into the wash you're going to cover over everything. It makes it a little bit more slick, allows it to spread over your entire base, which is awesome, and it has a really great effect. I've used it on a few projects already, and it was a ridiculously useful trick. It made everything work out really well, and I've used it a couple times. I've loved it both times. So I'm going to stick with the same thing here. So first, we're going to water down a little bit of lighter gray paint. We're going to cover everything on here. It'll show up really strong against the black. They do typically dry a little bit darker, just like our mixture here, which was a lighter gray, dried pretty dark. Once that paint is dry, we'll then put on our dry brush to give it some highlights, and then we'll move on to the wash. All right, so we have our very watery light gray mix. You don't have to be too detailed here. If you miss little bits, that's okay. A lot of it's going to be filled in with a combination of the wash as well. But just take your time, make sure you get in all the cracks and crevices. Again, if you're worried about how light it looks when you're painting on the black base here, it is going to dry a little bit darker. So don't panic too much if it seems to be too bright at first. All right, and so once again, it's time for my favorite part of terrain building, waiting for paint to dry. Alright, now where I normally mix my own washes, I ran into a little bit of an issue where I used up all of my darker browns and my darker blacks, and because I wanted to get this portion of the project completed today, I realized that I'm just going to have to use some of my model paint, my Citadel earth shade wash that I use on my miniatures. I'm going to use it for the wash on this. I'll just have to get some more because I'm assuming I'm going to use quite a bit of it on this project. But you know what, that's okay. You make do with what you have, and let's get into it. Now with this stuff, it's going to run kind of all over the place, and that's okay. We're going to be applying this pretty generously over the entire thing. So don't worry about the fact that it's running over everywhere. That's actually kind of good because it's going to fit inside the crevices and fill up all that space and rest where it needs to rest. Most of the time I would put paper towels underneath, but I did not think about that. Besides, my mat is covered in glue and paint and all kinds of things. I'm going to have to clean it off after the project anyway, so I really don't care. Now the cool thing about this is you see that there's little points where it's collecting inside the tiny little holes of the styrofoam. So it's going to give it a really realistic rock texture, which I think is pretty awesome. We are going to let this sucker dry, and once it is dried, that will conclude the main tower portion. And then the next stage of this project is we're going to move on to the lids. Alright guys, so I hope you like the tower building process so far. I realized when putting together the clips for this that it was going to be way too long for one single video. So what I've decided to do is split this up into part 1 and part 2. Thank you so much for watching part 1. Part 2 will be uploaded on the channel right away, so you can head right on over and see us finish up the top of the bell tower, as well as some additional little treats that I decided to add on to it. Thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe, and let's click on to part 2.